I'd like to introduce the members of our next panel for a discussion on whether Congress should end the war in Afghanistan. U.S. Senator Rand Paul was elected to the United States Senate in 2010. As a fierce advocate against government overreach, Dr. Paul has fought tirelessly to return government to its limited constitutional scope. As a hardworking and dedicated physician, not a career politician, Dr. Paul came to Washington to shake things up and make a difference. During his free time, Dr. Paul currently performs pro bono eye surgeries for patients across Kentucky. Additionally, he provides free eye surgery to children from around the world through his participation in the Children of the Americas program. Most recently, he traveled to Guatemala and Haiti on a medical mission trip with the University of Utah's Moran Eye Center. During his time in Guatemala and Haiti, over 200 patients, many of them blind with cataracts, had their vision restored. Dr. Paul's entrance into politics is indicative of his life's work as a surgeon, a desire to diagnose problems and provide practical solutions, whether it be in Bowling Green, Kentucky, or Washington, D.C. Senator Tom Udall began serving as United States Senator in 2009 after 2 decades of public service as U.S. Representative in New Mexico's State Attorney General. He was re-elected to the U.S. Senate in 2014 and is now New Mexico's senior senator. Tom earned his undergraduate degree at Prescott College and obtained a Bachelor of Laws degree from Cambridge University in 1975. He graduated from the University of New Mexico Law School in 1977. Tom then served as law clerk to Chief Justice Oliver Seth of the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and became a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Criminal Division. As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Tom is charged with congressional oversight of U.S. operations and programs beyond our borders, aiming to keep America safe, promote democracy, and foster international development and conservation. Tom is married to Jill Cooper, who is a former attorney and longtime advocate for the arts. They have one grown daughter, Amanda, and live in Santa Fe. Please give a warm welcome to our Senate panel.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to specifically thank the American Conservative, The Nation, and the National Interest magazines for sponsoring this, and also George O'Neill for sponsoring this as well. People will say that they want the parties to come together, they want us to get along, they want us not to yell and scream at each other and figure out how we can do something together to be good for the country. Well, I think foreign policy is one of those areas, and I think there is, some say, a right-left continuum. There is something that we can get along and talk about, and there really is evidence that it's been working. My personal belief is that we've been at war too long in too many places. It's around the globe. I mean, it's a war that really seems to have no end geographically, has no end temporally. It seems to go on and on of its own course. One's reminded of Orwell in 1984. We were at war with East Asia before West Asia before. We're no longer clear why the war started. We've just been told we're now at war with a new country or a new nation. We now have soldiers that will be fighting that have been born after 9/11, and we're still in Afghanistan. We have troops in 50 of 54 African nations. We have 1,000 troops in Mali. We have another 1,000 troops in Somalia. And if someone can explain to me the Somalian civil war and all the different sides in Somalia and who we're supposed to be supporting and how world peace is going to break out after we solve Somalia, please get with me afterwards. There are more U.S.-directed attacks in Africa, believe it or not, than the Middle East. Most people don't know this. We have more active military missions going on as we speak in Africa. And yet we've had no vote in Congress as to whether we should be at war in Africa, in any of these countries. We actually haven't voted in Congress in 16 years to authorize any war. I think President Trump was right in his State of the Union when he said that great nations don't fight perpetual war. And yet today we are mired in perpetual war, not only in Africa, but particularly in Afghanistan and throughout the Middle East. The congressional authorization to go to war in 9/11, after 9/11, is now used to justify war in Mali, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, you name it. There's probably 15 other places that supposedly they say we have authorized war. Much of this came from saying that we would be at war with associated forces, but if you read the 9/11 proclamation, it's not in there. In fact, even, I know Wikipedia is never wrong, but if you read Wikipedia on this, Wikipedia will say the 9/11 authorization was to go after the people who attacked us and associated forces. Doesn't mention that, well, that's not really true. The associated forces came later on as an interpretation by various administrations. So the original authorization never mentions associated forces, but this has come to be a big deal now, and it's really the justification for war everywhere, all of the time, and it's become really a justification for war against an ideology. Sometimes when the State Department or the government officials or military officials come before my committee, I like to ask them and put them on the spot. I haven't gotten a response yet, but I usually ask them, tell me who is left. Tell me who you would like to kill or capture or punish that had anything to do with 9/11. Tell me their name, and we'll talk about whether we should go after them. I've yet to hear a name. I don't think there is a name of an individual left that had anything to do with 9/11, directly or even indirectly. We're now talking about associated forces of associated forces. We're talking about descendant organizations. And it really completely obscures the fact that a lot of times war has to do with the local circumstances and the local customs, discriminations, and hatreds of various people in various parts of the world. But they're not all so simple as, we hate America and we're going to come attack America next. There's been some debate as to how we fix this. And so there have been many that have come forward and they say, well, the problem is Congress is not acting, so we should act, and we should have a new AUMF. The problem I have is that the various permutations of the new AUMF have basically been to legitimize and give authorization to all the places we are at war. One of the ones that's come before our committee actually codifies for the first time associated forces. And I'm like, well, many of us have been disputing now for 2 decades that we should be at war with associated forces. Now you're putting it into the new authorization. And basically, the way we read some of these new attempts at authorizing the war to do our job and for Congress to be involved, actually, we think authorizes war in as many as 24 different countries. So that's not really what I'm trying to do. I want less war, not more war. And so I have opposed most of these new authorizations. I have supported sunsetting and getting rid of the authorizations. Most recently, Senator Udall and I put forward a resolution that would bring the troops home from Afghanistan and get rid of the authorization over a year's period of time, which I think both he and I think we could do quicker, but that was our compromise to say, we'll wait a little while. But really, when we offered this up and when the discussion came forward and when President Trump said that he was going to remove troops from Afghanistan, the other side, the neocons and the hawks, put forward a resolution in the Senate immediately saying, no, we cannot leave. It would be precipitous. It's like, really? 17 years is precipitous? A decade and a half, almost 2 decades, and it's precipitous. But then they also define it such that you can never leave. The other side of it is they define it, well, if you tell us when you're going to leave, you're telegraphing to the enemy when you will leave, and you're cutting and running, and you're surrendering, and you're cowardly. So you can't announce when you're going to leave, which would be a gradual leave, and you can't leave now, or that's precipitous. Really, how do you leave? They've defined leaving as an impossibility. I think the biggest problem we have is that we've gotten away from the Constitution. The Constitution really envisioned that there would be a problem with the executive having too much power. They feared the kings, who were all brothers, sisters, cousins of each other in Europe, were always fighting. And it seemed like there was perpetual war in Europe, and we didn't want that. So we purposely didn't give that power. Madison put it this way. He said that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, the Constitution, with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. We haven't paid attention to that for so long. And occasionally you'll hear lip service to it, but we have the power to snatch it back at any point in time. Now, we did something, I think, profound that really was underreported and didn't get enough attention, is that's the invoking of the War Powers Resolution on Yemen, and basically saying to the president, we didn't authorize it. Not only did we not authorize it, we don't approve, and we want you to bring the troops home. Now, the resolution had some problems. It exempted al-Qaeda, which to me was sort of the idea that tacitly we were saying 2001 authorization gave them the right to go after al-Qaeda. I didn't want that in the resolution. But I did have them add one line that I've been adding to a lot of resolutions. And this is a line to say nothing in this resolution is to be interpreted as a new authorization for force. Because you realize if you exempt al-Qaeda and then you vote for this, people could say, oh, well, you voted basically tacitly to give them the permission to have war in Yemen against al-Qaeda. I'm not only against helping the Saudis fight the Houthis, I'm not for fighting anybody in Yemen unless we vote on going to Yemen, unless we vote on a war in Yemen. So I differ from some on that and have tried hard to make that point. But it was historic. I don't think we've ever before had both houses vote on something to rebuke the president and say that we shouldn't be at war. Even during Vietnam, Senator Leahy will talk about at the very end, and like 75, one committee voting against funding. But really, it never, I think there may have been one full house, but there was never both full houses voting against the Vietnam War, even as unpopular as it was. We have 165,000 troops overseas. We have active war in Somalia, Mali, Libya, Niger, Algeria, Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen, and the list goes on. We also have troops in a supporting role in large presences around the world that there's been some discussion of. We have 35,000 still in Germany, and I thought it was telling a comment from Merkel last week when she said that absolutely there's no way in the world she's going to reduce one iota the foreign aid she gives to other countries in order to improve or increase her defense spending. I thought that was a pretty informative statement that she's giving money away to other countries, but she still expects us to take the bill for NATO. We, I think, are 22% of NATO. I'm kind of like the same as the UN. I think we should pay proportionally. So if there's 28 countries in NATO, I'm for 128th. There's 140 in the UN or however many in the UN, I think 140th, I'd be happy. I'm not against diplomacy and not even completely against NATO, but I don't like footing the bill, and I also don't like the idea that I think many of the new countries that we've added have simply been tripwires to get us involved, to possibly get us involved in other wars. While I say right and left have come together, I think there is one area where there's been an impediment. And I think the impediment has been, the last election. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. President Trump won the electoral vote, and there's still a great deal of unhappiness. The country's evenly divided. But I think because of it, we're losing out on some things in the foreign policy realm that could be done better. I frankly am for more diplomacy, even with Russia. I'm for more diplomacy, even with North Korea. And I think that particularly with Russia, we haven't been able to have a thawing in any kind of relations or improved diplomacy, and we're losing some real things because of it. I think one of the extraordinary things that Reagan did that was outside what people expected of him to do was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. It was a big deal, and some people say he got it done because, only a person who people thought was so strong on national defense could actually make a treaty with Russia. But it's now going by the wayside. The New START Treaty may wane and go away as well. But I think some of it's because we've become so angry at each other in the Trump investigation that some on the Democrat side aren't willing to say, well, we still should have relations with Russia. I frankly think we should take sanctions off of Russian legislators. I think we should let them travel to this country. Now, I was unsuccessful with that, but I've been promoting the idea. I've almost given up because I only vote for it right now. But I think it's a good idea because you don't know who among these Russian legislators might be the next Gorbachev. Maybe there's a 35-year-old Russian legislator in the Duma who comes to our country and visits and then visits again. Maybe they like the arts or the literature or the openness of our society and they want that for their country. Maybe they're influenced by coming here. If we don't have them come here, it's a problem. Plus, we cannot talk about our differences if we don't let them come. In conclusion, I would say that I don't think a new AUMF is really the answer if it authorizes war. I want to try to end wars, and so I'm for ending AUMFs, but not really for a new AUMF, really probably of any kind. But most of the new AUMFs have not been limiting, they've been too expansive, and I think, I'm afraid, authorize more war. The big constitutional question, not only with war, but also with spending up here, is the separation of powers. our founding fathers were very prescient. They were very specific. They really divided up the power so somebody wouldn't get too much. And the checks and balances were meant to stymie too much power accumulating anywhere. I think recently the issue of spending is a problem. We can't let the president spend money. We had a huge debate up here. You can agree or disagree on how much we should spend on the border, but we had a huge debate and Congress made a decision. Look, I disagree with almost all the decisions the Senate makes, but that's the way it works. And we can't just sort of say the president, because he disagrees with what he got, can just spend more. So I'm working on a new bill, Emergency Powers Act, and we're going to try to get bipartisan support that removes a lot of the emergencies and makes sure that no president, this president or the next, can spend money that wasn't authorized. In this bill, we'll take away such emergencies that some people didn't realize exist, but they're very alarming. There's an emergency from 1934 that allows the president to take over all the television stations, all the radio stations, and really it's even less specific than that. Probably Alexa, I mean, probably everything you can imagine, which maybe the government should forbid that. But anyway, no, but the thing is it takes over all electronic transmissions and all broadcasts. And the president could do this under emergency. So it isn't just the access through the Emergency Act that's a problem, which we should change to make it more difficult. We need to eliminate some of the emergencies that we have we've had on the books that presidents haven't used but could use. Finally, I think it's important that there is right and left getting together. There's so much anger out there. All you got to do is tune into any comments on the internet. And I would say that from my perspective, it doesn't represent Washington. It's one of if there is fake news, this is it, that we hate each other. Senator Udall and I have had a good relationship. I don't think we've ever had a crossword. We don't agree on everything. We have disagreements on several things. On some we agree. On foreign policy, we have a great deal of agreements. On civil liberties, on privacy, we have a lot of agreements. But the thing is we are not up here yelling and screaming at each other. Most of us have a good relationship. I can probably tell you 8 out of 10 things that I do disagree with him on, but we're not going to do that because we're going to work on the things we work on together. And really, that's the way Washington is working, and it's so misreported. And I've enjoyed working with Senator Udall, and I was talking to him the other day because he announced he was going to retire in 2 years, and he said before he retires, he's going to try to end the war in Afghanistan. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Rand, so much. And that's a big task for us to do that in the next 2 years. But greetings to all of you. If I sound a little hoarse, it's all the allergies out there, but I'm doing fine. But I want to, first of all, just thank the Committee for Responsible Foreign Policy for hosting today's event. It's always a pleasure being with Rand, working with him on issues of war and peace or civil liberties or some of the privacy issues that we joined together on. And I just thought I'd cover the issue of the War Powers Act, which he has, the vote in Yemen, and maybe one other subject, and try to keep it short so that we can visit with you. Whether our nation goes to war, whether we risk the lives of our servicemen and women, whether we commit enormous resources to wage conflict around the world, this is one of the most important decisions that Congress makes. Congress has the power under Article 1 to declare war. Only Congress, and we should never really forget that. And we should exercise that power responsibly, with oversight, with great attention. And I think both of us will tell you right now, serving on the Foreign Relations Committee, we don't do that. We don't do that. And I'm very upset about that, and I think there's a lot more that we could do in that area. Why aren't we doing more? That's, to me, an interesting question, and I hope we get into it when we sit down at the chairs here and have a discussion and then maybe entertain some of your questions also. I think Congress punts a lot of times because they're hard votes. I think one of the other reasons is the bipartisanship is very hard to find in this body and where we are on these foreign policy issues, on war and peace. And so what that does is create a vacuum for the executive to get into and to go off into many of these areas, fighting wars that Congress has not authorized. The importance of bipartisan cooperation when exercising Congress's war powers cannot be overstated. If we don't work together, we abdicate this authority to the President. Congress ceding this power to the executive is not what the founders envisioned. There's no doubt about that. They squarely put that responsibility onto the Congress to make sure that any war has broad support. They didn't leave the decision to one person, not even one president. And I think both of us will agree we're not picking on one president here. There are several presidents that have assumed a lot of this power. The U.S. has been engaged in years-long military conflicts around the world, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and more recently in Syria and Yemen, to name a few, and yet we haven't seen a declaration of war. Congress has issued what many believe are outdated authorizations for military force, the so-called AUMFs. So you're going back on these AUMFs to 2001, 2002, and I think Rand outlined that very well. I was actually here and voted for the AUMF immediately after 9/11 that authorized force against those who committed the 9/11 attacks. But when I took that vote, I never thought that we would be in Afghanistan almost 18 years later, and after largely completing the underlying mission of removing core al-Qaeda blocks and killing Osama bin Laden. Our troops have fought valiantly, and that's one of the things we say in the legislation we've introduced. They've done everything and more that we've asked of them, but we have failed them. We have not done enough to end this conflict, to stop the mission creep. I visited troops in Afghanistan in 2010 on a bipartisan CODEL. Even then, I called for a responsible end to what was then and now the longest war in U.S. history. And I don't believe that the 2001 vote authorized invading any country in the world housing terrorists not associated with the 9/11 attacks, including Syria. I've been consistent in my opposition to U.S. military intervention in Syria, and as far back as 2013 when President Obama proposed military action in response to Bashar al-Assad's use of chemical weapons. Syria is different from Iraq and Afghanistan. We have never been asked into Syria. It's an invasion. Whether it's Syria, Yemen, or in Afghanistan, we should not be involved in war without our national interests at stake, explicit congressional authorization, a well-defined mission, and an exit strategy. Endless war in the Middle East is not sound foreign policy. Now to talk about the Yemen a little bit, because I think this is one of the areas where we've seen some bipartisanship and where there is some hope. I do think we're on the precipice of a new period of collaboration across the aisle on the left and right when it comes to stopping endless wars and reining in military force overseas. On both sides of the aisle, there's genuine concern about Congress ceding its authority on matters of military force and concern with our involvement in disastrous conflicts overseas. For example, many of us very much oppose the United States continuing to support the Saudi-led war in Yemen, where the Saudi kingdom is carrying out a relentless war targeting innocent citizens and civilians. And there's bipartisan concern about the president's refusal to hold Mohammed bin Salman accountable for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And that's why the Senate voted 54 to 46 to end U.S. assistance to Saudi Arabia in its war against Yemen. 7 Republicans, including Senator Paul, joined Democrats in that vote. And the Yemen resolution represented a too uncommon show of bipartisanship in the exercise of our constitutional authority. Now, Senator Paul and I have introduced legislation to end the war in Afghanistan and bring our troops home. It's the so-called Afghan Act. This war is the longest war in U.S. history. We can count 2,300 American lives, 20,000 wounded, and $2 trillion spent. I don't want young men and women who are not even born when this war started to go fight a war where our objectives have already been achieved. And I'm concerned that that 2001 AUMF will be used to justify U.S. military force in new areas like Iran. And let me also say, if you all were there and you go back and look at that history on 9/11 and what happened, there was a lot of indication that from President Bush that we'd only be there for a short period of time because he talked about specific objectives. And we achieved all those objectives very quickly. And that's the one thing I think that Senator Paul and I talk about a lot is when a president declares, when a president moves forward with a declaration by Congress, they should do so in such a way with an exit strategy, outline objectives so that Congress can then step in and exercise that oversight. We also have a resolution to try to make sure if we're going to go to war in Iran, that we do it with Congress exercising that Article 1 authority. So with that, Rand, I'm going to sit down and we can engage in some discussion here.
So I think we'll have a little discussion, then we'll open it up to the audience. You were talking about the bipartisan, and I talked a little bit about right and left coming together, and I think we're always hopeful that there's this burgeoning movement that's bringing right and left together for less war or for more congressional restraint or more congressional oversight over war. But there's also the opposite consensus. You know, we're this right-left continuum on one side, but there's also this right-left continuum, which really is the majority. And if you look at most of the committees, the chairman of most of the committees, right, Republican and Democrat, are actually more from the pro-war caucus. It's been that way for a long time. Andrew Bacevich writes about it being the bipartisan consensus. I think, though, it goes against the consensus of the people. You look at polls. You look at a poll in New Mexico or Kentucky, I mean, well over half the people are ready to be done with the Afghan war. You give them the choice, the people in a plebiscite would vote no. Why is it that you think that the will of the people isn't getting transmitted to their representatives?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's one you and I think, have agonized over a lot because we try to represent our constituents. We listen to them. We know they want to end these wars. And I think one of the big things is that the structure of the committees and the whole way it moves forward doesn't take into account the people. Many times the committee chairs, and I'd say this on both sides, worry more about the administration they're closest to protecting them rather than doing oversight. I think both you and I think that there are many people we could call before the committee. I look back on the Proxmire, who was a Democrat, and during the Vietnam War, he pulled in huge numbers of experts on these issues and debated them and educated everybody. And I hope that you and I working together can get the leaders on all the committees, whether it's armed services, foreign relations, intelligence, and others, to do that bipartisan work and get balanced witnesses that can educate us on the issues and get it done.
I find it kind of humorous that sometimes we have these committee hearings, and in the committee hearings, I keep waiting for the other opinion to be heard. But in the committee, typically if you're in the majority, if there's 3 witnesses, the majority party gets 2 and the minority party gets 1. And yet all 3 are on the same side of the issue every time. You know, I mean, you get the people, and there's so many institutional forces within the State Department, within the Pentagon, that just say, well, we just need to get in a little better shape in Afghanistan. We can just get a little bit farther along. I was struck, I read Stephen Cole's Directorate S, and in there he mentioned Richard Holbrooke's, this long memo he sends President Obama at the beginning of the administration, so we're like 2009, sends him like this 50, 75-page thing, and point number 1 was, there's no military solution. This is in 2009, before we do the huge surge in Afghanistan, 100,000 people. Holbrooke writes to President Obama, he says, there's no military solution. That's point one. Point two is we need to have a surge. And it's like, how do we get this? And even now, if you ask, if everybody in here were a general and we opened it up and everyone was being honest and we said, is there a military solution to Afghanistan? I don't think we'd get anybody to raise their hand. The generals are all admitting it, and yet they still want to send our sons and daughters over there thinking, oh, we'll get a better negotiated settlement. And I call it the Vietnam village strategy. If we take one more village, they'll negotiate. We just need to bomb one more or take one more village and we'll get a better negotiated peace. And I think in the end, the peace probably won't be that good, but the war is not that great either. And that's the hard part, is figuring out as we leave Afghanistan, people want it to be perfect. They want it to be peaceful. The democratic government stays in power. The Taliban peacefully becomes part of the parliament. And it's hard to promise people that it's going to be perfectly rosy. I guess maybe just in comparison to what we have, which isn't that great either.
Well, the part of this that you've really hit on, what you were saying, has to do with mission creep. Really, when we went into Afghanistan, we were very clear. President Bush, first of all, talked about, and I haven't heard this term in a long time, terrorist organizations of global reach. So he talked about, that's okay, of global reach. And so what he was...
I've got your answers now.
Yeah, so. No, those are the questions you and I submitted to each other, but you got the answers. And secondly, we should be talking about that. What he was talking about in the biggest possible way was, if the organization is organized, has resources, has the capability and is skilled and able to get out there, we should be worried about them, and we should be watching them and figuring out what our strategy is going to be. But the other side of the coin is, why aren't we working with countries, Rand, around the world to try to see that there's less terrorism through diplomacy, as you talked about? Why they don't assume some of the responsibility? Is every single terrorist in the world our responsibility? I don't think so. I don't think we want to be the world policeman when it comes to that situation. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Iran and where we go on that, because it seems to me we're building up to another war there. And I don't know whether it's going to be presented to us in the Congress, which it should be, which you and I believe, if we're going to go to war in Iran, we ought to have the Congress weigh in. We ought to have hearings. We ought to learn all about what the issues are. But we ought to be exercising our Article 1 authority, and that's one of the ones we've been working on together.
I'm with you. I'm very concerned that people gloss over the idea of regime change and think that regime change, they'll greet us as liberators in Iran, and they'll just love the fact that we're coming. In fact, sometimes it's the opposite. The people actually rally together when they see outsiders coming, and they rally to repel outsiders as opposed to thinking it's a great idea. Sometimes we hurt freedom movements also by supporting them, because then through nationalism, people are like, oh, if America's supporting you, we don't want to be part of that movement. But I've talked to the president a lot about regime change, and I listen to the things he says. And the one thing that he says over and over again, and I think he's been consistent for a decade or more on, or longer, is that the Iraq War was a mistake. He says it was the biggest geopolitical blunder of the last generation, and I agree with him. But it's not always the same logic I hear from him or his administration on Iran. They're sometimes, to my mind, maybe a little bit flippant that we have, not only have to be tough, but we will go and do something with Iran. And I think it'd be a big mistake. And I think the Iraq War created a big vacuum, changed the balance of power. I think the Iran War, a bigger, more populous country with more of a military, we'd win. We can win any war, but at what expense? And so I do worry about that, and I think the general principle of the Iraq War being a mistake, my hope is to try to influence administration to believe that the idea of regime change has generally been a mistake in Libya or wherever else we've done it, not just in Iraq. And we'll see where it goes, and I think it's important that we all make our voices heard to make sure that people don't think it's going to be a walk in the park just to have a regime change in another country in the Middle East.
Just for the record, I was here for the authorization of force and voted against Iraq, which, at the time wasn't a popular thing to do, but very important that people stand up, speak out, put down the specifics. And after that early speech, you go back and look at it and you say, everything that was there was out in the open. I mean, we had people coming forward and talking about the weapons of mass destruction situation and how it was exaggerated. We in fact had in New Mexico scientists from the national laboratories that are over there with the IAEA working with them, and they were calling me and telling me, what they're saying is accurate, and you should go with that. And so there was a lot of confusion, but I think if you took the time to listen to people that were knowledgeable, you would come to that conclusion.
And I think one of the worst things about the run-up to the Iraq War was I think purposely there were people in that administration promoting the idea that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. I mean, really, they had people writing on the bomb saying this is payback for 9/11. They were confusing people, I think, on purpose to gin up and to be able to go through this war. One final question, then we're going to open it up. Somebody asked me yesterday in the hall, reporter, are you planning on doing a war powers resolution on some of the other places, Somalia, Mali? And I think it's a good idea and worth entertaining. My question to you is, do you think we can keep the coalition together? Because even in Yemen, people exempted out al-Qaeda. They're going to argue that Somalia is about al-Qaeda, although I think Somalia is about a long-standing civil war, and we should have a debate. Even if you think it is al-Qaeda, we need to have a debate to say, do you think these people are plotting to come and, wreak havoc in America? Are they really a threat to us? Could we aid some people around them? Do we really need to be in the middle of Somalia? What do you think happens if we were to have a war powers vote on Somalia?
Well, I think we would we'd make some progress on it, because I think there's huge frustration around the world in terms of how we're getting into conflicts and not doing all the analysis, not being fair with the American people in terms of sharing the true reasons that we're there. But we need to study carefully which one we pick next, to go forward, visit what Rand's really good at doing, both of us, visiting across the aisle, talking with folks as to what they feel about the issue, and then taking that back and revamping and moving in the direction. But I would hope that many of these areas where we don't have a AUMF, where we don't have a declaration of war, we ought to be pushing the envelope.
And also,
I don't know what
and something new came out of this, because about a year and a half ago, we started pushing resolutions to disapprove of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. These are privileged resolutions, which mean you get to vote on them. Most things, if I've got an idea and I submit a bill like our bill on ending our Afghan war, they're not going to let us vote on it. They have all the power, we don't. But there are certain privileged votes, and one of them's on arms sales, and then the other's on this War Powers Act. So if we decided to put something forward on Somalia, they can't stop us. And they hate it because we take the agenda out of leadership in both parties, and then we direct the floor for a few days, and we try to get the attention of the media to discuss these important issues. That's one sad thing, though. You're talking about war and peace and whether or not we're going to send our young men and women to war, and yet we're too busy. The news channels, we won't get into it, but they're obsessed with other things other than war and peace, and I think important issues. With that, why don't we open it up for questions?
Thank you. Scott McConnell, the American Conservative. I've asked this question before to people, but never to someone so authoritative. I was very alarmed by your comments about the possibility of war with Iran. And it strikes me that, one, Iran is kind of or partially a democratic country, unlike Saudi Arabia. And so my question is, who is it that gets to decide that Saudi Arabia, which contributed the 9/11 terrorists, is a friend and that Iran is an enemy? How is that decided?
I think, first of all, the place we ought to start, is there are not necessarily, when you look at countries, that we should drop into categories and just say they're an enemy, we never talk with them, we never have any dealings with them. I would make the argument on Iran, and I don't think I've talked to Rand about this and be interested in his thoughts on that, but Iran, in terms of its approach on the issues and where it's coming from, and there are many, and if you go to the Iranian people, there are huge what I would call sympathies towards the West. And we have a large Iranian diaspora here in the United States of America, where there's a lot going on back and forth and a lot of discussion. So I think that if you look at our foreign policy, and one of the things I really like about Rand is when he looks at history over the long term, why is Iran so empowered right now? It's because we went into Iraq. Both of those countries were enemies of each other and were kind of a counterforce to each other. They actually fought a war before we went in. And then we took out Saddam Hussein. The militias and the Shiite militias in Iraq are now very friendly, and there's a lot of interaction going on. So I think if we intervene like that, we should make sure that we're doing it for a purpose and we don't have the unintended consequences. Over to you.
Well, who should decide? Obviously, the Constitution says Congress should decide, and unfortunately, many of these decisions are made by a single individual, and that gets back to the whole problem. I think that we look at the Middle East through a skewed lens. Every day you hear Iran is the largest state sponsor of terrorism. And it's sort of like a bromide. It's been said over and over again, so it must be true, and maybe it is true, I don't know. But what I think is that Iran and Saudi Arabia are different, but both equally and possibly are creating problems in the Middle East. Iran is a regional player predominantly, where there are Shiite minorities. They either are protecting them or trying to get them into power within their countries. Saudi Arabia, I think the problem is bigger. So I say, because I try to play off of the way we describe Iran, I say, well, Saudi Arabia is the largest state sponsor of worldwide jihadism. And I think that is true. They teach a hatred of the West, of Christianity, of Hindus, of Jews, everywhere. Most of the people fighting in Pakistan are trained in madrasas funded by the Saudis. Tens of thousands of madrasas in Pakistan. Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim nation, actually has a much more, I would say, and this is from someone who's not Islamic, but has, I think, a more moderate form of Islam and always has. And yet, I think they've been infected by the Wahhabism of the Saudis. And so I think it is different when we talk about regime change. Some people say, well, if you're a libertarian or non-interventionist, you should be fair to Saudi Arabia. Well, fair means that I'm not for regime change in Saudi Arabia, but I am for withholding arms. So, I mean, you don't have a right to our arms. And in fact, if there's one uniquely private industry that also really, I think, has a public purpose, that's our arms. So not anybody should be able to buy an F-35. I like the idea that we're now looking at restricting the sale to Turkey. Arms should be contingent upon behavior. But I do worry that people think that just the president gets to decide whether we go to war in Iran, and that is a problem. And so we have to have these debates back and forth and try to grab back that power. The vote on Yemen was an attempt to really have Congress grab back that power.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hi, Kimberly Dvorak. I have a question here. If we want to kind of end all of this, all of these covert wars, isn't the first thing we need to do stop the funding for it? And what are your comments on the president using the Overseas Contingency Act to get around the budgetary numbers that are actually fueling these wars?
I would say yes, funding is we should discontinue funding. I will tell you, though, that some on the other side will say, well, the declaration of war never meant what you think it means, and it really is anachronistic, and we just don't really do that anymore, but you can stop funding anytime you want. The problem with it is it's very difficult to stop funding when soldiers are in the field. So if I introduce a resolution tomorrow to say, we're just not going to pay the salaries of the soldiers in Afghanistan, it's not getting very far. You know, I have 3 nephews in the military. I mean, it's hard to stop funding for war once people are out there. But I think even in our bill, we sort of gave them 45 days to develop a plan and begin bringing troops home, and it would happen over, because it'd take a while to bring everybody home anyway. So funding is more difficult. You're right, we do have the power of the purse, and we should do it. It's just more difficult politically to actually do it.
Yeah, and I agree with exactly what he said. I think the better approach, and remember also, there are a lot of countries in Afghanistan that are working with us. They've been our partners, they have troops on the ground. So when you do it as we do in our resolution, where you come up with a 45-day plan, you take a year to withdraw, you allow the communication to go on between all of our allies there as to how and specifically we're going to do it and who comes out when, and do it in such a way that you give the best possible chance for Afghanistan to stand up on its own.
Talking about what's going on in Africa, can we curtail this before it becomes a huge issue for us?
Well, I think funding's one way, but also probably the other way is actually bringing forward a war powers resolution saying that the president doesn't have permission to be in Somalia or Mali or Niger or all these places. But I'm wondering if we get the same amount of votes, and that's sort of the problem, because they purposely carved out al-Qaeda and the Yemen vote and said it only about, and there's been a lot of publicity about the humanitarian disaster, which gained us more votes too. So I think I'm getting the hook sign. We got to go. All right, thank you.